So the next topic I'm going to discuss is LED setup and the LED database inside Pixera. As you may have already noticed, we have, besides our projected database, also an LED database ready to use for you. So you're basically able to build your custom LED walls in here for an easier setup. Now, we've already worked with screens, with the generic screens, and we've already taken a look at displays. What now follows is LED panels. So let me quickly expand my list right here. As you can see, there should be all available LED manufacturers in here. As the LED market is shifting quite fast and there are lots of new LEDs coming out every year. If there is one model, or if you're using one model that's not yet present in the LED database, of course, please tell us so we can add it. If you need to do a quick setup and you cannot wait, you can find a generic panel which you can modify up to the likes of your LED wall, so you don't have to wait for us. Now let's take a look, for example, at the ROE range of LEDs. When I select an LED on the right hand side in my inspector, I will find some information on the specification of the panel. I see the size, I see the panel resolution as well as physical resolution, the pixel count, pixel pitch, as well as the viewing angles, brightness in nits, and weight as well as power maximum. Now, in order to get the LED wall in, all you have to do is drag and drop it into your workspace. And as you can see, what we are going to work with is just one single panel. And now in our inspector, on the topmost position, what you will see is a panel array. So in here you can basically now modify your LED and build it here inside Pixera. So I can change my horizontal count, for example, and do something like this, as well as my vertical count, and build my basic LED setup, as you can see. And if we now scroll down, we will find in our specification tab the correct pixel count, the correct weight, as well as power maximum. And this information can be used further and utilized in order to print out plans, which we will take a look at afterwards. And of course, you're also able to use all the snapping and modificators, which you know already from one of the first modules. So let's again add an onyx LED wall. Let's modify it and let's make an LED stripe, for example. And of course, you can, as with regular screens, copy and paste your LED walls. Something like this, for example. So another copy and paste. So we have 3 LED walls in here. And let's say you want to pre-visualize a special LED configuration. Let's start and snap the LED walls together. So I can do something like this, And of course I can now turn my camera, switch here to the top, and change my rotation point to be around here. That wasn't enough. A little bit more. There we go. And also for this wall, change here, change the point. There we go. So that's of course always something you can use and utilize. By the way, to get better overview, you can also display the names here on top. And of course, it's highly suggested to then also rename the LEDs. Let's call it side left, for example, middle, and side right. So the next topic we're going to discuss is output mapping for LED. Most of the time, LEDs have some special resolutions as well as special aspect ratios. Like in our case here, we are using 3 LED stripes, and each of them has 2304 by 288 pixels. And as we're working in a computer environment, we are bound to standard resolutions, standard DESA resolutions, which can be played out on the computer. Now, the output assignment works in the mapping tab. And in here, we won't need the library as we don't need projectors. We are again going to use the outputs in the Live tab. You may remember in the Live tab, you will always find your local systems as well as the systems over the network. As I have a single client systems in here, I only see my local system. And once I select my local system, again on the right side in the inspector, I can find some information. I can rename it, of course. I can see the IP address, the default storage drive. So this is where content is being distributed when you do a multi-client or when you want to distribute or grab content from an external source. You see the license as well as manage license and engine reset, restart, close, and start. So in here you can manually restart or close, for example, the render engine. And down below you see a performance tab. So in here you can exactly monitor CPU, RAM, and data performance. Now, once I expand my local system, I can now see my graphics card. And to describe it again, what you see here is direct information from your PC, from the NVIDIA driver. So we immediately see the Quadro P2000 graphics card in here, and I can immediately see my outputs. So there's one GUI output running at full HD and one second output running at 2560 by 1440. By the way, I would highly recommend to never mix resolutions. I only do so here because here at home on my multi-monitor setup, I have 2 monitors with different resolutions. I would suggest to never do this in a live situation because mixing resolutions could, of course, result in tearing because the pixel clocks are vastly different. That's why please always try to avoid something like this. Now, once I have my output selected, I can see some information on the right-hand side. I see a name, I can rename it if I want to, the status, resolution. If the output is aggregated, I can also split the outputs. I can assign it to an image device, which I can find here. And I can change color, standard, and the gamma standard. If you want to play back, for example, 10-bit or even 12-bit and hybrid log gamma, everything is in here. As already mentioned earlier, Pixera is full 10-bit or 12-bit, or let's rather say it's internally running everything in float, so infinite bits are ready. Now we somehow have to now connect our output to our 3 LEDs. And in order to do so, the first thing you want to do is you want to check that screen selection is activated in here. If it is at projectors, as you can see, I cannot select any of the LEDs. So let's go here to screens, and also by pressing Shift and Tab, you can change between the selection. Now what I can do is I can now select my LED. And I now immediately see on my right hand side some information, especially the outputs. And up here, I will, as soon as I have an output selected, see my output, and I can then shift my outputs. Now, in order to access the output, I will again drag and drop my output onto my LED. First one, second one, and third one. Of course, I can assign multiple LEDs to one output. I could also assign one output to multiple LEDs to multiple outputs. So there's a lot of mixing I can do in order to get my pixel mapping to the result I want to achieve. Now let's activate the test grid, which looks something like this for LED. So we have a better visible representation here in our outputs. So what you will see now in the warp tab, you can, by the way, increase and decrease this here by pressing shift, holding shift and scrolling in here by holding the left mouse button. What we'll see here is a representation of our physical output. So that's 2560 by 1440. And what I can do in here is I can now freely move my outputs. So this is now my middle LED, and I can now replace it completely free on my output. Let's now put it in to 00, back to 00. Everything in here works into pixels. Now, let's say I want to shift my side LEDs down a little bit. I know it's 288 pixel high, so all I would have to do is shift it 288 pixels down below, as you can see. Now, or rather 289. So now I've got my first LED shifted. Now also the second LED. That's 288. Let's scroll a little bit in so we see it better. Or let's rather do it down in here in the inspector. You can also change it here. Once you have it selected here in the inspector, you can also change it and also replace it here. So it's 288 multiplied by 2. Now we have the correct pixel placement on our LEDs. So the first LED starts at 00, second is shifted down 289 pixels, and the third one 576 pixels. Now in the Pixara pixel remapping, you also have access to advanced remapping options. Now what you can do in here actually is you can dive in here. Let's take a look at it here. And what you will see now in here is our mapping feed rectangles. In the middle, when you dive in, you will always see your source. So the source, in our case here, is the LED. And what I can do now in here is I can reshift the size and split it up for cases where you want to do even more pixel mapping. And as you can see, as I shift it here on the right hand side, on my output, the size shifts too. So what we can do in here, for example, is we could divide it by 4 to make it really small. And I could now add multiple feed rects. So I could, let's rename this, by the way, to have a better overview. In project, you can find your LEDs, and if you expand that, you can find the mapping feeds. So let's call this feed 1. Then let's add another feed by pressing plus. And in here, I will also divide this by 4. And shift it here to the side. And I can now snap this again with the same snapping options you would find on your regular workspace snapping. So if I press shift, I can now, as you can see, snap it right here. Let's call this feed 2. Then I will create another feed plus. Let's first snap it. And again, divide by 4. And this one we call feed 3. And another one, which we will snap and again divide by 4. And we call this feed 4. And this allows me now to even further place my feeds or replace my pixels on my output depending on what my LED controller wants me to do. Now everything is placed here on the top left corner, as you can see. Let's zoom in here a little bit further. You can, by the way, also flip this option here over. So let's go out, and once you select this here, you can press this button, and now we have a better overview here, as you can see. So now I've got my 4 feet here, and I can now start placing those. So let's assume my LED controller wants to have something like this. As you can see, snapping also works on here. So I can now snap this and do something like this, for example, and chop up my feet completely free. So as you can see, what I've done is I've taken the stripe which we had here, I've separated in 4 single feet, which I can then place completely free. Let's flip this over again. The shortcut is M for this, here on my outputs. Now, last but not least, let's take a look at it, how it looks like with content. In order to do so, I have separated the LED stripes into different screen groups. That's going to be the next topic on my list. And I've put videos on 2 of the sides. It's a video that matches almost the correct format. And let's play it back. As you can see here, it looks correct. And now if we go to the mapping tab, and now as we take a look at it, we can see that it looks quite different on the sides compared on the middle compared to the side. Here we have it chopped up into our 4 feed racks, and here we just have standard content playing along. Now we're going to talk about screen groups, and in order to do so, I've prepared a small setup. I've used 4 full HD screens, which I have placed, and I've also created a custom widescreen in order to showcase the screen groups. What you can do here, by the way, another small tip is you can also assign colors to screens in order to easier differentiate them. There we go. Now let's advance to the compositing tab. And some of you may have already noticed that we have one more tab on the left top corner, which is called Screen Groups. And by default, whenever you create something in the Screens tab, whenever you import something into Pixara's workspace, one screen group is being created automatically, and all screens are going to be placed in this one screen group. Now this leads to the possibility to be able to shift content along this screen group, as this is a behavior which most of you, I guess, will or want Pixara to do. So I can quite easily stretch content and now have it played amongst different machines, different screens, different outputs, as you can see. Now, in the layers themselves, you can determine where the layer will be rendered to. So if you select the layer in the inspector, you will find the so-called screen presence. This is by default always screen group on all layers. Now there are 3 different settings. There is home screen, all screen, as well as screen group. You can also set up the setting by right-clicking on the layer, and screen presence, the first topmost tab, is going to be the same option. Now what does the setting do? It's quite easy. Screen group displays content on every screen in the screen group. As you can see, everything is in the same screen group. That's why we see it everywhere. All screens shows it simply on all screens. That's for the case that you want to use multiple screen groups, which we'll do in a minute. And home screen only shows the content on the selected home screen. As you can see now, as I move it around, we don't see content anywhere else but on the home screen. Now, the home screen is always determined by this option here in the layer. Here you can see current home screen is white. I could also change now my home screen to different home screens, as you can see. Or I could also drag and drop the layers onto different screens in order to change the home screen. Now let's go back to Screengroup. What I will do now is I will now start and create additional screen groups. I will separate it in one top screen group, one in the middle, and one bottom. You can do this by going into your Screen Groups tab and by pressing plus. This will add another screen group. And you can, of course, also rename them. So let's call the top one just top. And the second one we call mid. And let's create a third one, which we call bottom. Now I can quite easily shift screens by just drag and drop them into different groups. So here goes my white and my bottom right and bottom left. Now, as you can see, everything is has been changed. Now, in my compositing window here on this icon, I can change between either no outlines, outlines with wireframes, and groups. And now I can also assign different colors to my group. For example, let's do this one red. This here, let's do violet, and this down here we do green. Please keep in mind that the coloring you do here doesn't affect the coloring in here. It's two different pair of shoes. Now let's dive in to have a better visible representation on what we do. Let's also set it here to display the groups. Now we can better see it. Now, as you can see in my inner compositing, the content stretches amongst all screens. But as I've separated it to 3 different screen groups, remember the two bottom are here, the white screen is here, and the top are here. Content is only being rendered on the selected screen as my setting is set up to screen group. Now, if I add another content and put this one here on top, let's select this one and dive in. I could now also increase the size in here. And as you can see, as this content is on top of my other layer, it would theoretically render also on this one, but then again, as my screen setting, my screen presence is set to screen group, it's only rendered on this particular screen group. Now, if I was to set this on all screens, as you can see, it will now render on all available screens. And by doing so, you can quite easily create setups where you can separate content rendering from onto specific screen groups and make really awesome setups without the need of setting up a lot. Let's also dive in here so we can actually increase the size here. As you can see, I've now created a setup where, let's put this layer on top, where I've got 3 different screen groups, and all the layers, again, by default are on screen group, where the content is only rendered on the particular layer. And then I've got one layer coming on top where my setting is render on all screen, which will now render on everything. Now let's get back to our LED setup and let's get a little bit into the realm of perspectives. As we have a 3-dimensional setup here in terms of screens, and with 3-dimensional, I mean we don't have it flat out on a 2D X and Y position placement. We are also going back into the depth. The placement of screen groups and the so-called perspective isn't that easy anymore. So we've already than the hopping between inner compositing and outer compositing already quite some time. So what exactly is the inner compositing and what is the outer compositing and why do we need it? So the compositing and the content workspace in Pixara basically splits into two different 3D worlds. The first 3D world is the one you always work with, which you can see here. That's the so-called auto compositing, or also scene view, what I like to call it. That's basically where you rebuild what you have on site. You can put your venue in there. You can set up everything as you would find it in the real world. And besides that, when you dive in, you get access to a second 3D world, which allows full 3D compositing. So now, what do I mean by full 3D compositing? Let me quickly put some content onto here, and let's dive in. So as you can see, we're now in the inner compositing, and in terms of content compositing, I cannot keyframe in X and Y. I can also go back in Z. So we have full 3D space in here available for your content compositing. And you can also use 3D models, by the way. Now, on setups, like we have it here, as you can see, the setup of the so-called perspective isn't all that easy anymore. And from time to time, you may want to manipulate them. So what you can see here, those beams are the so-called perspectives. And they basically film into this 3D compositing space and then film for each screen individually, a point of view, and feed that back into the outer compositing in your scene view. Now, in here we got two different setup options, which you can find on your screen group themselves. There is one content sampling mode, which rather works in a, let's rather say, 2D environment way. So you always look at the inner compositing like a 2D flat surface, an X and Y surface, like we use from the content world. And we place our perspectives on this 2D flat surface. And then there is the spatial mode, which will basically rebuild what you see here in the auto compositing. So it will always mimic the actual 3D world's positioning. So now if we dive in, as you can see, our perspectives all of a sudden are positioned completely in 3D, and this would allow me complete 3D content workflows. So depending on the setup, that's not what you want to do, because you still want to be able to shift your content precisely from left to right to get content going around your banner. So let's go back to content sampling again, and let's take a look in here. And what you can now do in here is you can now modify those perspectives. You can change here on the top from layers in compositing, which allows me to actually crop content in here, to perspectives, which will now give me access to the actual perspectives. And as you can see now, I can now freely place them. So I can start and place my first perspective. I can again use the shift lock in order to lock them up. Let's try to be precise. And also the second perspective. There we go. And now I have a correct setup. And what I can do now is I can now, as you can see, go from left to right and do a keyframe animation, for example, or expand the length of the clip in order to move it from left to right. So let's go back on our selection to layers in compositing. And let's go in here and let's save this. And let's create a short keyframe animation. Let's go here and let's also snap this here and save. Now, as you can see, I've got my animation. Content following along correct.